Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to the patch 5.2 first half banner review. We have Chasca and Ororon as new characters, and we have a Lyney rerun. The other 4 stars are Sucrose and Barbara, and then we have an interesting weapon banner with Lyney's signature and Chasca's new signature bow, as well as 2 new weapons, the Waveriding whirl and the flower wreathed feathers, along with Favge's lance, the flute, and the bell. First, we're going to talk about Chasca. Now, if you want to know everything that I think about Chasca, make sure you go check out the Chasca pre-release video. If you want to hear my thoughts once I've actually tested her, make sure you subscribe so that you can keep an eye out for the first impressions video as well as the post-release analysis video that I'll be posting later on. But we can still give you a little early impression of her, for those of you that haven't watched the pre-release video. Chasca is a character that is both good and bad. Based on what I think about her so far, I think that just power-wise, she's a character that has the potential of being relatively strong, but she does have a lot of potential gameplay issues that are going to make her often uncomfortable to play. Her biggest issue is twofold. First, her damage is mainly single target and is really bad in AoE. Second, she does not have a lot of team versatility. It's not that she can't work in a lot of different teams. It's that outside of her few pretty good teams, if you're playing a team that doesn't fall into her few pretty good teams, you'll have pretty underwhelming damage on top of all of her gameplay issues, which will make it very difficult to justify using her over other carries. Chasca is a character that's going to be heavily reliant on both Bennett and Farina, which is rough both in terms of team building because Bennett and Farina are characters that tend to be in pretty high demand, but also which means that if you don't have Farina, going for her is going to be a lot harder to justify. So for those of you that haven't watched her pre-release, very quick summary of her kit. She's an animal character that doesn't do animal damage. She does damage based on the elements of her teammates. She loads up a bunch of elemental bullets, and then she shoots them all at once. And the elements of those bullets depends on the elements on your team. The damage of those bullets is significantly higher when the bullets have an element that isn't animo than when the bullets have a damage type that is animo. And so because of that, you do not want to play her as an animo damage dealer, even if she's an animo character who is a damage dealer. The majority of her damage will not be animo. Because of that, ideally, you want her to be able to trigger a multiplicative reaction, either vape or melt. But if you look at the team options and you look at units that actually work well with her, because she's a charge attack carry, she doesn't work well with Singsa or Yelan at all. And none of the cryo units are honestly that great with her, which means that if you don't have Farina, you're either gonna move away from Vape or Melt and lose a bunch of damage because of that, or you're gonna stay in Vape or Melt and use a unit that doesn't work that well with her. Like if you're using Mona, for example. She's an attack scaler, so she does really well with Bennett. And Bennett plus Farina means that she will have Pyro and Hydro Bullet, making it a lot easier to try to get a reaction, a multiplicative reaction of Vape on one of her shots. And it's really the last slot that's somewhat flexible, even though there are certain units that do a lot better than others, namely Ororon and Xiangling being the best two. Now you'll notice that neither Bennett, Ororon, or Xiangling give resistance to interruption, which means that defensively, Chasca will rely on her added resistance to interruption from her skill to try to not get interrupted. But it's not perfect, so you may still get knocked out of certain things. Overall, she's really one of those characters that if you're trying to find the best character to put on your Bennett Farina team, it's not going to be her. But if you like her and have Bennett and Farina available, she should be able to perform relatively well. And you should be able to get your clears without that much of a problem. I think one interesting thing is that in this Abyss, we have Hydro Tulpa on Chamber 3, and against Hydro Tulpa, if you're playing her default teams, if you're playing the Farina team, not only is Farina not going to do any damage, but the Hydro Bullet from Chasca will also not do any damage, and she's going to lose pretty much like a quarter of her damage, which is definitely a little bit unfortunate. And it's sad because she's a bow user, so she can knock down the Amblite Drake, but even if she didn't, the way that her damage works, she wouldn't even need to knock it down to damage it. I think that Chasca is a lot more tailored to the upcoming next Abyss, the 5.2 Abyss, which as of now has been leaked to be 2 Vishaps followed by Primogeo Vishap, then the Tenebrous Papilla, whatever, which is something that you break with a bunch of elemental attacks, and you break even better if it's Night Soul, so Chasca's gonna be great at that. And then a Light Drake on the last chamber, which he's a bow user, so you can knock it down. This Abyss, there's 2 relatively important AoE waves on the first half, but Tulpa is going to make it a lot harder to justify using her on the second side. Although I would expect her to function in both of them because the buff is so good for her. In any case, like I said, Chasca is a unit that's looking relatively good, but definitely isn't one I would recommend as a default good carry to get. We can quickly talk about her early constellations as well. Her C1 is going to be a nice little increase to your damage. It's a relatively reasonable C1. Her C2 gives her a nice amount of front-loaded damage as well. Overall, she has pretty reasonable early constellations, but we'll talk a little bit more about the power of those early constellations when we talk about her signature weapon. Next, we can talk about Lyney. I think Lyney is somewhat similar to Chasca in that he's a character who is overall relatively strong, but will tend to show his power a lot more in single target. Although, compared to Chasca, I'd say that he adapts a lot better in AoE. In exchange for that, I think Lyney is a lot more reliant on defensive options. Lyney's best teams generally tend not to run defensive options, but that makes him much harder to play, and most people won't enjoy playing those teams with him. I think that with Chasca, it's going to be a lot more comfortable without defensive options than with Lyney. Lyney is just as dependent on Bennett as Chasca is. However, he's less dependent on Farina. I'd still say that Lyney's best team is probably one that uses Farina, but I think he has a lot more flexibility in his team options compared to Chasca. He has a decent amount of non-Farina teams. Pretty much only one archetype, right? Like, you pretty much only play him in Mono Pyro. Even when you play him with Farina, you're not really focusing too much on the potential vates he's getting. Mono Pyro or, like, Chevgar's Overload. Despite all that, in terms of teammates he's going to be good with, I think he tends to be a bit more flexible. Although I wouldn't call him very flexible either. Lyney also has some pretty reasonable early constellations, although I'd say they're probably a little bit worse than Chasca's early cons. Lyney is a character that is pretty good at front-loading his damage, so when you look at like high investment speedruns, you'll see Lyney a decent amount, but when you look at just overall usage, he generally doesn't tend to be all that popular. We can take a look at the Abyss data, and I wanna like put an important asterisk here. Abyss data is not an accurate representation of character power, but it is a useful tool to look at how popular characters are. So Lyney is a character who is very strong this Abyss. The Spiral Abyss buff gives up to 80% attack to charge attack characters, and the lineup with Tulpa, Light Drake, and a mostly single target first chamber as well is with a first wave that's pretty easily one-shottable with his burst skill at high investment. This is a very good Abyss for Lyney, and despite that, only 20% of people that have Lyney use him. On top of that, this data is looking specifically at people who 36-star Abyss and submit their data, which is going to be a little bit skewed towards harder characters, in the sense that more casual players that don't 36-star Abyss tend to prefer easier to play characters and maybe move away from characters like Lyney a little bit. So if I were to guess, I'd probably expect him to be closer to 15% usage rate outside of that. And again, right, this is a very good Abyss for him. In any case, the point I'm making here is that he'll generally be represented more in speedruns than more casual runs, and that he is a character who tends to overperform in speedruns and underperform in casual gameplay. With that out of the way, let's start talking about the 4-stars. The first 4-star I want to talk about is the new 4-star Ororon. Now, just like Chasca, if you want to know what my thoughts about him are in more detail, make sure you check out the pre-release. And if you want my post-testing opinion, make sure you subscribe and you watch the first impressions as well as post-release video. I'm not entirely sure I'll do a post-release on him, but I will at least talk about him in my first impressions video. I don't know if it'll be a dedicated video to him or if I'll include it in the Chasca video, but I will definitely talk about it on YouTube. I promise you that. For those of you that haven't watched the pre-release, Ororon is an electrocharge-focused damage dealer who is also a buffer because of the Roll of Cinder City set. He doesn't have buffs in his actual kit other than his C6, but he's an Atlan character who can use Cinder City, which inherently makes him a pretty decent buffer. With his kit alone, he's pretty much exclusively just a damage dealer. He does pretty okay damage, and you don't have to play him in a team that's mainly focused around Electrocharge, but you're mainly going to want to put him in a team where you have another Hydro character so that you can at least sometimes trigger Electrocharge. If you want to know the details about how all of his kit works, make sure you check out the pre-release, but the TLDR of it is he gains stacks when you hit with Hydro or Electro, and he deals damage based on his stacks, or when you trigger Electrocharge, or you deal Night Soul damage. His personal damage will tend to be at C0, not all that great. At C6, generally worse than Fischl. However, his AoE is quite good, unlike Fischl, which means that in AoE situation, he can perform better than Fischl, and that's without taking into account the fact that he gives a buff because of Cinder City. Because of that, I'd say that in teams that don't take advantage of Fischl's Ascension 4, which is generally quicken teams, Ororon will generally be competitive with Fischl, if not better than her. If you're in single target and Fischl is representing a decent amount of a decent portion of the team's damage, then Fischl will generally still outperform him. However, there are going to be a decent amount of situations where Ororon can be better. I'd say at C0, those situations will be relatively few and far between, but they will still exist because the Scroll of Cinder City buff is really good. And at C6, they'll start becoming a decent amount more common. Ororon's constellations from C1 to C5 are pretty much just more damage. His C5 itself is kind of ass, so it's mainly from C1 to C4. C1 makes his passive deal more damage. C2 gives him electro damage bonus, C3 is burst talent, and C4 is burst spinning faster and energy, which is effectively more burst damage and less ER requirements. And then finally, his C6 gives an attack buff to the active character when you trigger his passive. So it's a nice little attack buff to your active character. All in all, I'd say that at C0, Ororon is going to be relatively good. At C6, he's going to be pretty good. If you are not planning on getting Chasca or Lyney, I don't think it's particularly worth considering the banner, though. I don't think he's so good that you would want to risk a 5-star you don't care for just to get him. And the rest of the 4-stars, let's talk about them. Sucrose is a great character. However, Sucrose is one of those characters with awful constellations. Sucrose's cons are the biggest change in her gameplay between C0 and C6 is the C1 giving you a little bit more utility. C1 isn't actually that significant in and of itself, but if you miss your Guava Swirl or something, having another chance for it is nice. And it gives you a little bit more grouping. But because her skill cooldown is 15 seconds, most of the time this won't actually lead to more than one skill per rotation. You'll get 2 skills on like one rotation, and that'll be pretty much it. C2 gets you 1 more hit from your burst, but that doesn't really matter because your burst doesn't do much other than swirling, and the damage is not great. Talent levels don't really matter because you're building her full EM. Cooldown refund on normal attacks only matters in teams where you on-field Sucrose, but teams where you on-field Sucrose are less and less popular every day. I don't think they're bad. Personally, I still play the Su Sing Tomon team, the Sucrose, Singto, Changling, Fischl team. And I still think it's a great team, but it's not a popular team at all. And in most situations where you use Sucrose, you're not going to auto-attack on her, so this is completely worthless. Burst talent levels also don't do much. And then C6 gives you 20% elemental damage to whatever element your burst absorbs. However, absorbing with Sucrose's burst is often relatively unreliable. This is mainly useful in quicken teams where you're unlikely to absorb anything other than Electro, but even then, you won't necessarily absorb Electro because aiming Sucrose's burst tends to be a pain in the ass. All in all, her constellations really don't tend to do much, and so no matter how good she is at C0, once you have her, getting more copies of her just does very little, and so her being on a banner is really not that great. Finally, Barbara is a pretty bad character. She can see play in some teams. Barbara is a reasonable option in Nilo teams, and she functions as a healer in some Farina teams if you really don't have other options. But she just doesn't tend to be very good, and none of her constellations really matter. 1 energy every 10 seconds is 2 energy per rotation. Her burst cost is 80. It will take you 800 seconds to get your burst back from this. This is an overworld exploration constellation for new players so that they can generate energy while they're walking around and use their burst when they take damage. C2 decreases cooldown and gives you 15% hydro damage bonus. This could be useful if you use her on a team or you play her with another hydro character, but you don't want to use her at all. So it's generally not going to be very useful. The reduced cooldown can be nice if you're playing her in a Nilo team and you don't get your Sacrificial Frog proc, since Barbara's skill only deals damage at the very start of it, which means that if you can't proc it later on like you can with Kokomi, it is what it is. Burst talent doesn't really matter. Her burst pretty much full heals your team anyways. Barbara regenerates energy when she's on field, but you don't want to on-field her, so that's ass. Skill talents don't really matter because her skill healing isn't really that significant and only heals the on-field character. It's a little helpful if you're playing her with Nilo because it allows you to build more EM without having to worry as much about your burst or about your self damage, but it's not great. And then C6 automatically revives someone once every 15 minutes. This is fine, I guess, but it's not good. Barbara's not a good unit. She doesn't have good constellations. There's really not much to say. So that leads me to my overall evaluation of this banner. I think if you are a completely new player starting this patch, it's a reasonable banner, but it's not a great one. Sucrose is a great character to get early into an account. Ororon is looking like the sort of character that will help give you a bit of direction, but if you don't have Farina, Chasca won't be that great, and you probably don't have a lot of the great characters with Lyney either. However, if you're planning on getting Farina later on, it's a fine banner, but nothing more than that. Especially considering the fact that Neuvillette is getting a rerun in the second half of this patch. I'd say that if you're a new player, you're definitely better off saving for now. If you're not a new player, you've been playing for a little bit, you already have some of the things that these characters need, and you're considering these banners. For Lyney, I think this is a pretty bad banner. I think none of these three characters generally will see much play in Lyney teams, and I think that if you already have Sucrose, her cons don't really do much. You don't want Barbara whatsoever. You don't want her cons. And Ororon, as of now, doesn't have too many teams where he's great outside of Chasca. He has a decent amount of teams where he's playable, but teams where he's great is mostly Chasca right now. And so unless you're going on the Chasca banner, he won't be that great to have on the banner. So I don't think this is a great Lyney banner. But when it comes to Chasca, I think it's a pretty decent one. If you already have Bennett Farina and you just like Chasca, you want to play her, Ororon being on her banner instead of on the second half is obviously something that's nice. So that's a nice little thing for you. Now let's talk about the weapon banner. And honestly, for the first time in a while, I am impressed by the weapon banner. I don't like weapon banners in general. However, for a weapon banner, this is pretty good. First, let's talk about the 5 stars. We have the new Chasca signature weapon. For 12 seconds after triggering a swirl reaction, attack increased by 24%. In addition, when 1 or 2 or more characters in the party are of a different elemental type from the equipping character, the damage dealt by the equipping character's charge attacks is increased by 20/48%. And burst damage is increased by 10/24%. This is a pretty good weapon for Chasca. That is about 30% better than her free-to-play craftable option, which is in line with most recent signature weapons. And it's running along with the first great magic. Now, the reason why I think this is a pretty good banner isn't because either of these weapons is particularly outstanding. Obviously, there are signature weapons that are quite good on the character whose signature weapon it is. But the main reason why I think this is a pretty good weapon banner is because Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage is pretty much the second best weapon for Lyney, and the first great magic is pretty much the second best option for Chasca. In other words, even if you get the wrong weapon, you'll still have a pretty good option, no matter which one you're going for. Now, I don't think that's enough to make the weapon amazing. I don't think either of these weapons is a particularly great default stat stick. The attack percent bonus is reliant on triggering Swirl. The reason why this weapon is good on Lyney is because if you're playing a Lyney team with Shalone and Farina, you get 48% charge attack damage, which is pretty good, but you also get a little bit of burst damage, which is also pretty good. However, as a general stat stick, the 24% attack is not something you're necessarily going to get, and this is not general damage percent. This is damage percent on specific damage types, so it won't be good on everyone. And then, same for First Great Magic, where the charge attack damage is not gonna help everyone, and the amount of attack percent you're getting will depend on your team, and in a lot of teams is gonna be relatively low. So both of them are like relatively average at best as like 5-star general stat stick options, but they're relatively good signature weapons that work well on both of the banner characters. So, if you're looking for an upgrade for either your Lyney or your Chasca, and you're currently on Song of Stillness, or whatever other craftable option, even if you get the wrong banner weapon, it's still going to be a reasonable upgrade, which means that you don't necessarily need to have enough to reach pity twice to expect an upgrade from the banner. Now, you could still get an off-banner weapon, and if you do, sucks to be you, I'm sorry to hear that. Keep in mind that you have a 25% chance to get an off-banner weapon when you're not guaranteed from the epitomized path, but you're a lot more likely to get an upgrade even if you don't reach pity twice, which is a nice upside for the banner. Next, we can talk about the 4-star weapons on the banner. We have the new Flower Wreathed Feathers Bow. Medium base attack, attack percent substat. Decreases gliding stamina consumption by 15%. Doesn't matter. When using aim shots, the damage dealt by charge attacks increases by 6% for every 0.5 seconds. This effect can stack up to 6 times, and it will be removed 10 seconds after leaving aiming mode. It's nice for charge attackers. At R5, it slightly outperforms the free-to-play options, but at low refine it doesn't, and getting R5, especially now that they've changed epitomized path to only require 1 point instead of 2, is very unlikely before getting at least one of these 2 banner weapons, and it's not better than either of the banner weapons, even at R5. So all in all, wouldn't recommend. Or it's a fine weapon, but it's not really a great thing to have on the banner. The other new weapon is a bit more interesting. Low base attack, high energy recharge weapon, which decreases swimming stamina consumption. Again, that part doesn't really matter. In addition, for 10 seconds after using skill, max HP is increased by 20%. For every Hydro character in the party, max HP is increased by another 12% up to 24%. So, in a team where you have at least 2 Hydro characters, this increases your HP by 48% after using your skill. 44%? Or 88% at R5. The fact that it gives so much HP from the passive at R5 makes it so that it can be a decent option on HP scalers, like Neuvillette, for example. If you get it to R5 on the way to, like, the Chasca weapon, it can be an upgrade for Neuvillette if you're currently using him on Proto Amber, but it won't be better than the Battle Pass weapon, nor will it be better than his signature. It's pretty much only if you have Proto Amber. And even then, it's not that big of an upgrade because Proto Amber's healing helps you stack Arena a little bit faster. Favge Lance is a weapon that is obviously one of the best 4-star weapons in the game. There are a lot of polearm characters that have Favge as their blessed slot, or at the very least as a very good option. We talk about it every time Favge is on banner, but I don't mind talking about it again. Xiangling, Favge is the best option for her in a decent amount of teams where she's not the main damage dealer, and is still a reasonable option even if you're playing a Vape Xiangling team, although it's generally not going to be better than Catch in those teams. Is almost always best in slot on Zhongli, not great on Chao, not great on Hu Tao, often best in slot on Rosaria, reasonably decent option in ride and carry teams especially if you're playing her with Xiangling. It actually tends to be her best 4-star option in Rational because Xiangling does so much of that team's damage that alleviating your ER requirements for the whole team tends to be better than giving her Catch to increase her personal damage. But obviously, Catch is also good on her, so it's not like you need Favge for her in that team. Very good option for Toma. Very good option for Yunjin. Very good option for Shenhe. Very good option for Candice. Not good on Sino. Very good option on Yao Yao. Very good option on Mika. Very good option on Chevreuse. Not great on Arlecchino. Decent option on Emilie. And very good option on Kachina. More than half of the polearm characters have Favge as either their unequivocal best in slot or often their best in slot. Favge Lance really is one of, if not the best Favge weapon. It's between Favge Lance and Favge Sword because there's just so many characters that want Favge who are polearm characters. The Flute is a dog weapon and the Bell is a dog weapon. There's really not too much to say about them. Flute gives you motion value after some normal attacks, but like that's completely worthless. The amount of motion value is incredibly small and it's an attack stat stick, not even a crit stat stick. Flute has been worthless pretty much since Inazuma gave attack percent stat sticks as craftables. At least before that, if you had to choose on an attack scaler between the Flute, Iron Sting, and Prototype Rancor, then the Flute could have seen some play. But now you also have Amenoma, you have the Fontaine craftable. There's just no reason to ever play Flute. The Bell, also pretty worthless. Bell could see play eventually if we get an HP scaling Claymore character that is played in teams where their HP matters a lot, but they don't need to give Favge to the team. but at least right now there's no character that Bell works with, so it's pretty much a worthless weapon. Overall, I'd say the 4-star lineup is about average, right? We have a great weapon in Favge Lance, but I think polearms are the ones that have the least amount of different weapons that go on the weapon banner. So Favge Lance tends to be there relatively often. But despite that, it's still definitely the best polearm for there to be on banner. I think Waveriding whirl is relatively decent. I think Flower Wreathed Feathers is okay if you somehow manage to get a bunch of them early and get unlucky for the 5 stars. And then Flute and Bell are pretty worthless. So 4-star lineup, relatively average. And then the 5-star lineup is, in terms of just power, isn't the best. But the fact that it's 2 signature weapons that each work well on their non-signature character with Lyney and Chasca, I think helps a lot to make this banner more palatable. So this is a pretty decent weapon banner. And I think the fact that either of them are a good weapon option makes it so that, as a general rule, if you're choosing between an early constellation for Chasca or Lyney versus the weapon banner, I think for the first time in a while, I would consider a bit more strongly going for the weapon banner, which is a bit frustrating because specifically for Chasca, Ororon constellations are going to be great for her, but the 2 other 4 stars are so ass for her, and the weapon you can lose your your pseudo 50-50 to is pretty good. If this wasn't a bow or like a great general stat stick, I would lean a lot more towards early constellation than weapon banner if you're looking to get a dolphin upgrade. But because it's specifically Lyney's bow, I'd say it's really up to you. If you're at like C4 Ororon or something and you think you can reasonably expect to hit C6 on the way to a Chasca constellation, then I'd probably lean more towards the character banner. But if you're at C0 Ororon and you're unlikely to hit C6, then I'd probably lean a bit more towards the weapon banner. I think it's a lot more case by case than it usually is. But yeah, that pretty much does it for this banner review. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know who you decide to go for if you decide to go for either of them. Or if you are deciding that you're better off holding on to your primos and going for either the Neuvillette rerun, or if you're hoping that Mawika will be strong. In any case, thanks for watching. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.